Good evening and welcome everyone to tonight's Economic Reconciliation webinar with Experiences Canada. Before we start, we're going to turn to Grandmother Irene Compton for an opening song.
My name is Gail Bouquet, Senior Director of Programs and Development here at Experiences Canada. We pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. On behalf of Experiences Canada, I want to thank you, Grandmother Irene, for being with us today to open our gathering, and I offer you this tobacco to thank you for bringing the spirit of the drum.
Miigwech, thank you very much for that beautiful offering of tobacco. And it's my honor to be here to open up your gathering. When we start our gatherings, we always cleanse ourselves. So that's why we like the medicines, the smudge. So this is my smudge here. And I'm going to light this smudge, and then we're going to do a purification. And why we do that purification is because we want to make sure those ancestors come through that eastern doorway to be with us. And before we do that, we have to smudge. So we're going to cleanse our minds so that we'll have clarity and understanding. We're going to cleanse our ears so that we will listen with intent. And we're going to cleanse our eyes so that we can see a good future, especially for all our youth. And we're going to cleanse our mouth so that we be respectful to say good things to one another. And we make that most important connection from our heart to our Creator. Every day we make that connection. And I like to cleanse my tummy because that's where all your emotions sit. So we just want to take any kind of scattered emotions, and we just want to ground ourselves to Mother Earth so that we can be truly present for one another. So our songs are our prayers. And the song I've picked for you today is called Bindigan. Bindigan in Ojibwe means welcome. So we're going to invite our Mishomis, which is our grandfather. We're going to invite Nokomis, which is our grandmother. And everybody else is Nagi-Wagama. So it's Mishomis, Nokomis, Nagi-Wagama. And I'm going to travel around this medicine wheel. We're going to come in through that eastern doorway in that yellow part, and we'll travel around this circle. We're going to start with 4 honor beats, and then we'll do this beautiful Bindigan song. It's a welcome song. So this is a heartbeat, and I like to think about my ancestors coming through that eastern doorway with big smiles on their faces, knowing they get to visit us again. So let's invite them in. Bindigan Mishomisik, Bindigan Nokomisik, Bindigan Nagi-Wagama, wah-hey-ah-hey-ah-hey-ah-ho. And as they're coming in, we sing this beautiful chorus. Wah-hey-ah-hey-ah-hey-ah-ho, 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 wah-hey-ah-hey-ah-hey-ah-ho. And we're going to travel now to that southern direction, which is the red. And that's where all the youth sit. That's you, the youth. And we're going to pray for the confidence, the well-being, and the leadership of our youth, because we know that you are the leaders of the next 7 generations. So let's sing for our youth. Bindigan Mishomisik, Bindigan things in place that are good for our community. So we ask for the spirit of the bear to help us with that. Bindagan Mishon Misak, Bindagan no Kamisak, Bindagan Naki Wagama, Wahea Hea Hea Ho, Wahea Hea Hea Ho, Wahea Hea Hea Ho, Wahea Hea Hea Ho, Wahea Hea Hea Ho. This is our last round. I want you to reflect on your own ancestors. You know who they are. They're your helpers in that spirit world. And all we have to do is call on them and ask them for help. And they'll be right there for us. And they'll start arranging good things to happen. So with this last round, let's invite those ancestors in. Bindagan Mishon Misak, Bindagan no Kamisak, Bindagan Naki Wagama, Wahea Hea Hea Ho, Wahea Hea Hea Ho, Wahea Hea Hea Ho, Wahea Hea Hea Ho, Wahea Hea Hea Ho. Gee, gwetch everybody. So you have a good gathering.
Wonderful. It's so comforting to hear that music, and I want to thank Grandmother Irene on behalf of all of us for that wonderful sharing that we just had. So good evening, everyone. Bonjour à tous. My name is Deirdre Laframboise, and I'm the CEO of Experiences Canada. On behalf of our board of directors and all of us, we welcome you to the first webinar in the series of 4. And as part of our hybrid 2024 National Youth Forum. Really excited to have our youth participants and leaders. And we are thrilled to be presenting the topic of reconciliation and the focus of economic reconciliation. We were overwhelmed with applications from youth from across the country, and that only tells us at Experiences Canada that this is important and we need to do more. So we're hoping to do that. We just also want to thank all the speakers. Sandra, thank you for facilitating. Colleen and Candice for speaking tonight. And we are very grateful for the partnership and the work with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, who've helped guide us in this webinar series in bringing these speakers together. So a big thanks out to the center. And last message for all of you youth, we would greatly appreciate if you can complete the surveys that come after each webinar. It's really important for us to hear your voice and opinions, and we really want to always know if we're hitting the mark or how we can do better. So if you would please take a few minutes when you get that link to the survey, we would greatly appreciate it. So without further ado, I will hand this over to Sandra and our wonderful speakers so we can get this first webinar off to a start.
Thank you for that, Deirdre. So I said just briefly, but in case you weren't on yet, welcome. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Sandra Bender. I'm the Community Engagement and Education Program Coordinator with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. It's a long title, have to take a deep breath before I say that. So tonight's webinar, in fact, this whole series of webinars is about economic reconciliation. So we're going to introduce this concept in a way that's meant for folk your age. So we're not, this is not a webinar meant for 40-year-old economic experts. So you're in the right place. We're we're going to talk about the foundations of why understanding economic self-determination for Indigenous peoples is integral to reconciliation, how it's beneficial for both Indigenous people and for settlers here in Canada. Closing that socio-economic gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians would be a phenomenal contribution to the GDP in Canada overall. So we're going to start off this series with a discussion of the National Indigenous Economic Strategy. We're going to talk about how it's designed to drive positive change. We're going to address long-standing inequities and how to achieve inclusive growth for and with Indigenous peoples. So I'm massively pleased to be able to introduce our two speakers for tonight. We're incredibly lucky to have with us Kaylin Beaudry, who is an Anishinaabe from Wikwemikong unceded territory on Manitoulin Island, located here in Ontario. Although currently based in Ottawa, Kaylin works with national Indigenous organizations and First Nations locally to advance the rights of First Nations peoples. Her education background consists of a diploma from Algonquin College and a Bachelor of Arts degree with a concentration in business law and a minor in Indigenous Studies from Carleton University. She is currently enrolled with the University of British Columbia to advance her communication skills. So Kaylin is going to speak first. Our second speaker is Candace Loring, who is the Director of Indigenous Relations and Initiatives at Genome BC. So Candace is working to advance the Indigenous innovation ecosystem. Candace is also an adjunct professor in the Faculty of Management at UBC Okanagan. She held the role of Senior Advisor, Indigenous Relations and Initiatives in Equity, Diversity and Inclusion at METAX. As a proud member of the Gitwangak, pardon my probable mispronunciation, please do correct me when you speak, Candace, from the Gitsang Nation in northern British Columbia, Candace's passion for small businesses and entrepreneurship, along with her background in business management, has allowed her to expertly guide and support hundreds of organizations through collaborative innovation projects in her position at METAX. Through her commitment to advancing the National Indigenous Innovation and Entrepreneurship ecosystem, Candace serves on numerous councils and committees, including the Indigenous Advisory Council for the Oceans Supercluster, the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade Diversity and Inclusion Leadership Council Advisory Committee, and Minerva, BC. In 2021, Candace was recognized as one of Canada's most inspirational women entrepreneurs and business leaders by Canadian SME Small Business Magazine for her economic development work in Indigenous communities. She is a Chinook Scholarship recipient named Kelowna's 2022 BDO Top 40 Under 40. Candace was also named UBC Okanagan's Faculty of Management Alumni Builder Award recipient in 2023. So as you can hear, we have two incredibly impressive people. They're each going to speak for about 15 minutes. If you have questions for them, you can put them into the chat and I'll bring them forward at the designated moment. It'll be toward the end. So please do feel free to put your questions in. For housekeeping, this is being recorded. So if you're someone who is currently on the screen and you have things that beep and flash and whatnot, let's make sure that those are not doing those things. And I think that is about what I have for housekeeping. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Kaylin. Take it away.
Yes, thank you, Sandra and Deirdre, for the introductions, and Grandmother Irene for the song. I really appreciate it. I don't see my presentation yet. Okay. All right, so yeah, we're discussing economic reconciliation today. Yeah, and next slide. Sorry, can we move to the next slide? Oh, there we go. Thank you. So before I discuss economic reconciliation, I think it is important to take a step back and highlight Indigenous contributions to trade and work ethic prior to European contact. In order to explain how we got to using the term economic reconciliation, we must first understand that Indigenous way of life prior to contact followed by economic injustice and is now shifting into an era of economic reconciliation. So Indigenous peoples prior to European contact lived abundantly off the land, taking only what they needed from the environment around them. This contributed to developing hunter and gatherer skills that followed the seasons and migration patterns. Indigenous people have always been hardworking people, for example, through aquaculture and harvesting of fish. Economic injustice. Indigenous peoples are consistently left out of economic opportunities from development and resource extraction on their lands. Socio-economic gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. This means that Indigenous peoples continue to live in poverty. They have inadequate housing, lack of access to clean water and other public services such as education and employment opportunities. Economic injustice results in Indigenous peoples resistant and protest to economic development on their lands without proper consultation and accommodation. Which brings us to economic reconciliation. In broad terms, it means creating prosperity and well-being for Indigenous peoples. Economic reconciliation is a call for a new path forward, for renewal and for doing things a different way. It is transformative change that is critical to self-determination by having Indigenous people manage their own resources and wealth. Next slide. Economic reconciliation really encapsulates many ideas and perceptions for how best to undo the economic injustices Indigenous communities experience. It focuses on the self-determination of Indigenous peoples and empowering them to manage their own wealth and resources for the well-being of their peoples. What does this look like? The basic principle for economic reconciliation involves the recognition and realization that Indigenous people are tied to their land. Economic reconciliation is about sharing resources, sharing wealth, as intended by our treaties, which Candace will discuss in more detail through her presentation. Economic reconciliation means respecting each other's government and having a relationship based on respect and reciprocity. It means reaching a level of understanding and acceptance and awareness of Indigenous people's pursuits and rights. It also means a shift in how corporate Canada engages effectively with Indigenous people. Economic reconciliation also means working together to be equity partners of large-scale projects and empowering Indigenous people to contribute to the economy, workforce, business supply, and to become equity shareholders in projects developed on their lands. Economic reconciliation also means ownership, leadership, and inclusion from start to finish of natural resources projects, including the planning, operations, management, and closing of a project. Economic reconciliation can also mean the use of Indigenous governance models for projects. If Indigenous people participated in economic opportunities on this level, there is a potential for increase of 27.7 billion on Canada's gross domestic product each year after closing that gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. Next slide. The legacy of colonization has led to a society where Indigenous people continue to be at a disadvantage and cannot fully share and thrive in the economy. This is demonstrated through implementation of policies that either exclude Indigenous peoples or presents administrative barriers that hinders the process for participation. So aside from the policies that make it difficult for Indigenous populations to build sustainable economies and accumulate wealth, for example, the historical ban on Indigenous land ownership through the Indian Act. It is quite difficult to distinguish historical barriers from present barriers, mostly due to the fact that many barriers continue to hinder the progress for economic reconciliation to take place. I will say, though, one present-day barrier that does stick out is the fact that each nation has different views on what economic reconciliation looks like for their communities. There are other barriers which include impacts of colonialism, lack of infrastructure, lack of access to capital and equity, as well as procurement, lack to education and capacity building. There's shipping costs that are very, very high for remote communities. These are just to name a few. Next slide. On a positive note, although there are barriers, rest assured that Indigenous people are making economic reconciliation happen. Indigenous people want to participate in the contribution to Canada's economy. Indigenous people want to see their peoples and communities succeed and move away from managing poverty to managing wealth. Economic reconciliation is reflected in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Calls to Action number 92. It is through Call to Action 92 that corporate Canada can participate in reconciliation, and this call to action is addressed to corporate Canada. So there's some of the wording there, and there is also some subheadings as well. Next slide. So economic reconciliation in action. There are 3 examples that I want to share with you today. The first example is Buzzwa Fisheries, which is located in my community, Wikwemikong Unceded Territory. It is one of the largest aquaculture sites in Ontario, harvesting on annual 2 million pounds of fish. Fish harvested from this site supplies large grocery store chains in the province. First Nations have a strong background in aquaculture amongst Indigenous peoples. Throughout mid-1800s and prior to First Nation communities in this area, were supplying a lot of fish down to the markets in Toronto, Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago, and New York. The Crown government started instituting a permit and licensing system where they began leasing out commercial fishery to non-Indigenous people. This resulted in detrimental impacts to the economic activity, sustaining these communities for generations. It basically excluded First Nations from commercial operations. And again, this was one of the historic policies that have impacted these First Nations to participate in aquaculture. A second example is through the Indigenous Tourism Association of Canada. This association focuses on creating partnerships between other associations, organizations, government departments, and industry leaders from across Canada to support the growth of Indigenous tourism and address the demand for development and marketing of authentic Indigenous experiences. Indigenous Tourism Association of Canada has an established membership process that enables Indigenous tourism industry partners to engage with and to show support for Indigenous tourism. The purpose of Indigenous Tourism Association of Canada is to improve the socio-economic situation of Indigenous peoples in Canada through tourism. The third example is the Reconciliation and Responsible Investment Initiative. Together, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous investors can help build capital markets that integrate and better align with Indigenous values and ways of knowing. The Reconciliation and Responsible Investment Initiative approach is grounded in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Call to Action number 92, which was just shown in the previous slide. The Reconciliation and Responsible Investment Initiative envisions a financial system that empowers Indigenous perspectives, recognizes the roles of community values in investment decision-making, and contributes to protecting Indigenous rights and title. It is also guided by Indigenous investors and Indigenous-led organizations. The Reconciliation and Responsible Investment Initiative mobilizes both non-Indigenous and Indigenous institutional investors to use their voices and capital to promote positive economic outcomes for Indigenous peoples. These outcomes include improved Indigenous employment, support for Indigenous entrepreneurs, increased partnerships with Indigenous communities, and respect for Indigenous rights and titles. The Reconciliation and Responsible Investment Initiative work ensures that Indigenous rights, values, and aspirations are reflected and upheld in investment policies and practices, including in relationships with advisors and asset managers. Next slide. So the National Indigenous Economic Strategy serves as a blueprint to achieve the meaningful engagement and inclusion of Indigenous people in the Canadian economy. The strategy is supported by 4 pathways. So you'll see on the screen there is 1, peoples, 2, lands, 3, infrastructure, and 4, finance. Each pathway is further defined by a vision that describes the desired outcomes for the actions and results of individual strategic statements. The calls to economic prosperity, which is also a part of the National Indigenous Economic Strategy, recommend specific actions to achieve the outcomes described in the strategy statements. This strategy provides a guide to any government, corporation, business, or institution that is creating its own strategic plan or reconciliation plan, or policy changes, guidelines, or legislative changes. The calls to economic prosperity pertaining specifically to youth, which I have pulled out of the document, include the people pathway. So economic prosperity call number 1 is under the Indigenous entrepreneurship, and it calls for the creation of a financial literacy and business curriculum for youth and adults. There was another call, which is call number 10, which is to create youth, women, elder, and LGBTQS plus permanent forums. Call 11, which is to educate Indigenous youth on all aspects of Indigenous economic issues and approaches. And call 12, which is to seek the advice and guidance of Indigenous elders in all culturally specific aspects of economic development. Under the infrastructure pathway, there is call 63, which is to provide safe and culturally appropriate educational options for Indigenous students in urban communities. So these are the calls that are specific to youth. So if you have a chance to view the report, these are the ones that you might want to start to look at first. Next slide. Yeah, passing it on to you now, Candace. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening.
Thank you for that, Kaylin. Thanks for walking us through that in such a nice, easily understandable fashion. Candace, take it away.
All right, thank you so much. Wachaska hal isquis Candace Kentel Hazelton, and Claha Tui Deborah Nash Robert, Takasasil Isquaskasia Jonah Nash Caleb. Hello, good day to you. My name is Candace Loring, and my traditional name is Gwala Nakwala, which means I'm a hardworking, resourceful educator. And Nakwala is after my 6th grandfather, Grand Chief Nakwala, of which the Nicola Valley, Lake, and River were named after. And on my first slide, who am I? I really like to start by grounding myself in my identity of where I've come from, what has brought me here, and why am I even speaking to you today? Well, to start, I'm a proud mom. I'm a proud mom of 2 boys, Jonah and Caleb, and I took a bit of an unconventional path to get to where I am now. In these pictures, you can see me holding my most recent degree as I'm at convocation doing the walk, and that was when I completed my MBA in Indigenous Business Leadership at Simon Fraser University. I didn't realize that I was actually on film, and the whole convocation of thousands of people could see me at that time. But you can see the pride and identity of who I am as a proud Gitxsan woman. And I always start questioning myself, because that's part of the reality of being Indigenous and still experiencing imposter syndrome. I'm a grade 10 dropout. I didn't just get to this place and space and time through easy pathways. It was a lot of adversity to overcome. But with that, it brought me a lot of strength. So despite being a grade 10 dropout, I walked through the doors at UBC in 2012, and I walked out of those doors in 2016 with a UBC degree in business management, and most recently completing my master's degree in business. So I think it's important to ground myself in that, because we aren't defined by our realities, but the choices that we make within them. And for me, that choice, I completely changed the entire trajectory of my life because I made one choice, and that was to apply for school. So when I didn't think that university was even an attainable dream, I made that first step, and I applied to UBC Okanagan through the Aboriginal Access Program, and it's completely changed who I am. So my first degree being business management, I am now a faculty member in the business management program here at UBC. I actually just came from presenting to students in their live case competition. I'm going to jump to my next slide. So forging a career path. Well, I have always been a first. I was the very first Indigenous specific role hire when I was at Genome BC, which is where I am now. It's the first role of its kind. So nobody has come before me. I've really had to be a trailblazer and define what my role is. I actually co-authored my current job description at UBC Okanagan. And when I was recruited to Genome BC, I also co-authored my job description there as well. So don't let anyone tell you what your role is, especially if you're in a position of decolonizing spaces and places, which is what I do. I'm in a very unique space working to advance the national Indigenous innovation ecosystem through collaborative innovation projects. And when I think about creating economic reconciliation, it goes so far beyond what we could even imagine, because our economy and all of the stakeholders and rights holders within these spaces and places, meaning anyone who's impacted by that work, is a rights holder. We are all rights holders, whether you were a doctor, a lawyer, whether you were an entrepreneur starting your own business, whether you were the banker, whether you're the professor that taught business studies, whatever it may be, you play a role in economic reconciliation. Whether you are Indigenous or not Indigenous, you play a role in economic reconciliation. So right now I'm working in the innovation space as well as a teacher, hoping that I can create economic opportunities for Indigenous organizations so that they have that cutting edge of being in the innovation and research space, so that their businesses can stay relevant, and really empowering those businesses to leverage research and top talent within post-secondary institutions to help realize their business needs. So in my path, it has always been as the first, but with that work comes the responsibility of knowing that there are going to be people who follow in that path. And so everything that I do now is creating what is an expectation for anyone who works after me. And that is an important part of it. And I don't think that you thought that's what you're going to hear for an economic reconciliation webinar. But when we think about reconciliation, what does that mean? There must be truth before there can be reconciliation. Part of that is bringing our whole selves into spaces and places. Showing up and bringing your Indigenous voice is decolonizing spaces. Showing up and occupying space and place and recreating those spaces around you to ensure that other Indigenous voices will be successful in those spaces and places, that is a part of reconciliation. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that. And can I go to my next slide? So the slide here is Step into the River Economic Reconciliation Framework. And I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about this. I was actually involved in the creation of this. And what I really love about it is it starts with community. It starts with our children. It starts with our people, our families. And when this reconciliation framework was being created, the first thought was, what kind of an economic framework could one create that we would want to leave as a lasting legacy for our children? How are we leaving our future generations in a good place? And part of that comes from our 7 generations teaching, which is represented here. And with that, anything that I do, and I don't take a hat off of, okay, I'm an Indigenous prof today, or I'm working at Genome BC, or I'm speaking on a webinar. I am always showing up as my authentic self. I am Gwala Amnakwal. I am the woman that my grandmother raised me to be. I come from a long line of strong matriarchs, and that is part of reconciliation, is you being able to show up and be yourself, to be able to walk through those doors and not carve out pieces of your identity and of who you are, but be able to walk into space and place and own those spaces and places as your whole self. I am Candace, I am Gwala Amnakwala, I am my whole self. But with that and being my whole self, I can't be my whole self without acknowledging that the 7 generations and all of the ancestors that came before me, I would not be where I am if it wasn't for their sacrifices. And so when I acknowledge even some of the accolades or awards I've had, those aren't mine. Those are because of the matriarchs that came before me. If it was not for my grandmother's sacrifices, if it wasn't for my mother's sacrifices and all of those who came before, I wouldn't have even had a chance to walk through those doors at UBC, nor would we be having this call because of all of the work that has been done from the ancestors before us. So when I think of that 7 generations, all of my decisions need to be made honoring those past 7 generations of who have sacrificed so much to create space and place for us to have this time that we're in now. But then I also think about 7 generations forward. And what am I leaving for the next seven generations? If I'm making a business decision today, how is that impacting my children and children's children and until the future and beyond 7 generations? Because we are only guests on this land. I remember as a young girl, my mom had a picture in our dining room and it said, we do not inherit the land from our ancestors, but we borrow it from our children. And it's something I always thought about was, what we do today, we might not even feel the impact of that work. The incredible work of the TRC, so many of the people who did that work, were they around to see how far it's come? Their children will be, and that impact will be felt for generations moving forward. But when I think about economic reconciliation and creating these frameworks, I have to think about value and this idea, because we're brought up in these Western societies where everything is connected to value is money. Right? You can have 2 purses, they're identical. One happens to be a name brand, one is maybe from Walmart. They could be the exact same purse, but because of a label and the price, one being $1,000, one being $50, we attach this value to something simply because of this monetary value, this price attached to that. But through an Indigenous worldview, one needs to rethink about what value is, because if you truly think about what's the most important and most valuable assets that you have in your life, it's probably not going to be how much money you have in the bank or things that you can even purchase with money. I know for myself, I started off talking about my kids, my value, my wealth. My wealth is my children. Value to me is family, community. So that's what I really appreciate about this framework, is it centers family, community, children, and builds everything out from that. Because at the end of our life, the only thing that's going to matter to me, at least I know, if when I'm saying goodbye to my family, is how they'll remember me and how I will be remembered as an ancestor, but how I showed up for my family, because that's the most important value to me. So when I think of that reconciliation framework, I really need to step away from what I was raised in these colonial concepts of attaching value. But also I would reconsider, what does success look like within an Indigenous worldview? My idea of success when I was younger, I attached it to a monetary value, not knowing that that would actually just cause disappointment. And I remember when I reached that monetary amount, when my salary was finally where I thought that amount would be a success metric. And I remembered feeling nothing and crying afterwards, because I got to what I thought was success. And then I realized that was a colonial construct of success. It was money, and that money didn't change my life. It didn't change my family and where I come from, which is rooted in a lot of trauma, a lot of triumph though, and overcoming adversity. I am an intergenerational survivor. My grandmother went to the Kamloops Indian residential school, as did much of my family. But I don't just carry that trauma in my blood memory. I carry their resilience. I carry their strength. I carry the strength of my warrior uncles and the gentleness of my grandmothers and the matriarchs who nurtured us and protected us and kept our family together. So rooting oneself within space and place of your community and who you are, all of us play a role in economic reconciliation in whatever capacity that is. If you're selling bracelets, you are a part of economic reconciliation. You could be even selling lemonade, whatever it may be. I have a 16-year-old son and he loves to busk. He has Down syndrome and he plays his ukulele and he does very well. But he is a young entrepreneur, and that is a part of economic reconciliation, is being a part of it. So this idea of stepping into the river framework is an idea that we're all a part of something, but we're swimming in the same direction. And the reality is reconciliation is very personal, and it might mean something different to each of us. Can we jump to the next slide? So championing reconciliation and decolonization in the workplace. In this slide, I have a picture of the 2-row wampum belt, and this symbolizes something really important to me because it's one of our first nation-to-nation agreements. This was a treaty. This was seen as an early agreement, and the idea of being the non-Indigenous and Indigenous being able to go side by side, neither steering each other's ship, but this understanding that we could live mutually beneficially side by side here in this place that we now call Canada. And part of that dream and realizing that for me is the work that I do. So in my time at MyTax and Genome BC, and even here at UBC, I always work to advance decolonization within colonial spaces. And what does that mean? It means systemic change. This isn't just about hiring one Indigenous person and thinking, you know, we've done it, we have Indigenous representation. But championing reconciliation and decolonization means changing the way we think. It's heart work. We need to get away from the mind and we need to follow our hearts. And that's hard. And especially in academic spaces, when you tell people to stop using their mind and following their hearts. But a reality is we need to shift. It's an organizational shift. We need to create safe and inclusive spaces where everyone can walk through those doors and they don't have to carve out pieces of their identity, that they can show up and be their whole selves and know that their background, who they are, their identity matters and is just as important as anyone else in society. And that's really what it's about. And representation at all levels. We need Indigenous lawyers, like I said, everything. We need all representation across the board because we deserve to be there. We deserve to occupy space and place. And it's really important that we have those voices because decolonization doesn't happen without Indigenous voices from within. And I'll just jump to the next slide. Oh, I gave myself a timer. I'm doing pretty good. So what role can young people play in economic reconciliation? And honestly, follow your dreams. I could have never imagined to be in the spaces and places that I am today. It's truly an honor to be here and to know that all of these bright young minds are even having this conversation. Because when I was your age, we were not having this conversation. This wasn't something until I was in university that I found myself sitting in a colonial institution, learning about colonization of the mind, that I was able to rediscover myself as an Indigenous person and not carry shame. Because that shame was never mine to carry. That shame was colonial shame, and it was part of colonization. And there's no shame in reconciliation. It's truly about us. We're walking side by side, and it doesn't just happen on the side of Indigenous. It doesn't just happen on the side of non-Indigenous. It happens with all of us together, moving forward for a better future for all of Canada. So that's my final note. Follow your dreams because you might just be surprised where it takes you.
Well, thank you both so much for this. This is just incredible information, and not just information, but the spirit and the perspectives that you both bring to this. The world needs this kind of approach. We need Indigenous perspectives on economics to guide our relationships with the planet that, you know, colonization is destroying pretty rapidly. This spirit that you've talked about of thinking about economics in the sense of generations that have come, generations that will come, is such a stark contrast to the colonial view of, you know, capitalism and the me first mentality, me first at any cost, right? That leads us to things like using up all of any one resource without regard for what will be left for future generations or what kind of damage it will do to the land that the people that we will be the ancestors of will have left, right? Candace, I absolutely loved everything you said about forging your own path. I can't imagine how daunting that must have been for you. Would you say that forging your own path the way you have with all of these firsts is its own form of decolonization, rather than, you know, following sort of preset models of what a career should look like, what success should look like?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I show up and authentically can be myself in space and place. And I honestly, I feel like a salmon, and I love using this analogy, but I am salmon people. I'm proud Gitsan. We're people of the Skeena River Mist. And I remember when I applied for grad school, and I always felt alone being that only Indigenous student, that only Indigenous person in a business. And when you do the work of decolonization, you're questioning these colonial constructs, these normative ways of doing things, and you're saying maybe we could do it different. And that can feel really, sometimes people take that personally because maybe they've created a program, maybe they're attached emotionally to a way of doing things. Well, that's the way we've always done it. But it's okay to unlearn. It's okay to unlearn and relearn. And something I was told recently was that unlearning is just as sacred as learning. And it's so true, because there's things that I believed before, then I learned better. And the only thing I could do is I didn't carry shame of not knowing previously. I unlearned and relearned, and I changed the way I viewed the world. So be like that salmon, pressing back against colonial constructs and changing space and place all around you, and just showing up. Just showing up and being yourself is a form of decolonization.
Oh, that's beautiful. Sorry, I have reminders going off, and after I told people to turn off their things that make sound. If we're getting into the nitty-gritties of how, I think, especially when we're talking terms like economics, most of us here tend to think of that as a pretty grown-up concept, myself included, and I think I'm technically among that demographic. But how do Indigenous youth get involved in economic reconciliation? Kaylin, would you like to speak to that? Why should they, and how do they do it?
Why I think Indigenous youth should get involved with economic reconciliation, because the youth are our future. And as grandmother Irene said at the start, the youth are our leaders of the next 7 generations. The future is theirs, and therefore they need to be included in the discussions that are going to impact their futures, and that includes economic reconciliation. To the second part of your question, how can they participate in economic reconciliation? There's some examples that I presented in my slide. You know, through the National Indigenous Economic Strategy, there's the youth-specific ones, but I could also say that there is also, under the finance pathway under trade, Call to Economic Prosperity 104, the implementation of the Bay Treaty, simply just by educating yourself and others on existing Aboriginal and treaty rights, such as you know, Candace shared in her presentation about the Two-Row Wampum. Having that knowledge is ensures that there is awareness and potential to honor these rights, not just by Indigenous people, but by our counterparts as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So if I were, say, in grade 10, as a youth, how could I start getting involved in moving toward or promoting reconciliation within my own community, whether I'm Indigenous or not? Candace, you mentioned your son and his busking or selling lemonade. Would you agree with that, Kaylin?
Yeah, I would agree with that. You know, you can also sit in on your chief and council meetings, be a part of the, you know, try to get yourself through the door, not through the door, but at the table with our decision makers in our communities. Your voice is important, and our leaders need to acknowledge and respect that the future that they're forging is for you and the next 7 generations, and you need to be there. You know, try in any way that you can, but also, you know, maybe with your peers, sharing knowledge and educating each other is really one way that you can do that.
And I would just echo that about education, and in the words of Murray Sinclair, education got us into this mess. Education will get us out of this mess. And it's so true. I know I wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for education. And sometimes that just it isn't always within a colonial institution either. That education happens when you're out fishing with your grandma or your grandfather, or your uncles or aunties or nibblings, whoever it may be. It could be out on the land picking berries. It could be in ceremony. That education is really important, and being receptive to it. I know when I was in grade 10, I mentioned I was a dropout. It was grade 10 that I had left school because I had so many other things at that time that that I thought were a priority. And if I could go back, I would have definitely changed it and prioritized education, because there's nothing more important than getting that education to be able to set you up for success. If you want to change the world, it's through education.
Yep, I'd also like to add to that as well. As you're experiencing the post-secondary system, you know, you're also in a space where you can give your voice, and, you know, you're sharing, you know, whether it be the ways of your people or just, you know, what you know from your own community is something that other people aren't aware of. And, you know, people are really thankful for just hearing from a, you know, Indigenous perspective in that type of way. Oh, we lost Brenda.
All right, well, if Brenda doesn't pop back, we could go through some of the questions.
Yep, I do see a question from Ella. Did you ever think you were going to get to the place you are now?
I can tell you, I couldn't have dreamed it. I couldn't have dreamed it. I remember as a young girl, I had never taken a flight, and watching the planes flying over and imagining where they were going. And part of going into business, I thought I'd be this jet-setting businesswoman. And through work, travel's taken me all over. I've been to Washington, D.C. to speak on the importance of Indigenous women in science and technology. I'll be in Quebec next week. I get to share space and place with the top leaders throughout Canada, and to be a professor at UBC, couldn't have imagined
I just
it.
got back in. Let me make sure.
Oh, no problem. We just proceeded with questions. Little technical difficulties here. But I couldn't have imagined it. But I think a bigger part of it would be that I grew up wanting to have meaningful employment. I didn't know what I was going to be, but I remembered I just wanted to help and work on behalf of community. And I do that. I get to do that, and to have Indigenous students come up and speak to me, and in their very first class, they have an Indigenous professor. I couldn't have dreamed of that when I was a student, but they get to realize that. And I believe if you can see it, you can be it. And I can't even imagine what the future holds for your generation. And Kaylin, I would ask the same of you. Could you have imagined being able to hold the space and place you do? And you're a UBC student, you have a degree, the work you do with AFN is so important.
Yeah, I actually have chills because as a youth, I never thought I would be where I am. And, growing up on the reserve, I did experience a lot of the disparities that I'm sure many people have. But, education was the one thing that really kept me going. And I knew I wanted something more for myself, my family, and also my community. And as I got through the post-secondary system, I realized, I do want to help First Nations people, and whether I didn't know what that was going to be, but I knew that education was going to be the way that I was going to get to that path.
Absolutely. I think we need to go over to chat for our next questions. What is this? Even if we dropped out in high school, we can still make it in life now. How you all are, and can still go back to school and always graduate later in life. Absolutely. I mean, I wouldn't recommend it. I was a grade 10 dropout and I struggled. I believe you me, it was not easy. I remember crying after final exams in my undergrad, just praying that I passed, and I had to work twice as hard, 4 times as hard. I remember taking calculus and meeting with my professor afterwards, and he said to me, "Don't you know SOHCAHTOA?" I was doing calculus with no pre-calc. I had no idea what SOHCAHTOA was. I went home and had to watch YouTube videos to teach myself pre-calc, and it was difficult. But just because one door closes doesn't mean that opportunities don't exist. It doesn't matter what has happened in your life. I always believe you are one choice away from changing the entire trajectory of your life, whether that is school, whether that is sobriety, whether that's starting your own business, working for your community, being a language warrior, whatever your passion is. When you're able to be able to work towards that, find your gift and use it, you can always change your life.
Yeah, I have to echo that sentiment as well. I didn't finish high school in 4 years. I was delayed 2 years, and it took one chance just for me to make that change, and I did, and I took the initiative, and I reached out to my teachers and asked, what did I have to do to get past this? So really, you have to do it. You got to follow your dreams. Sorry, I'm trying to plug in my laptop.
I really like this next question too. What is something you would tell your younger self if you could tell them something? It gets better. I think it's one of it. It's hard being a teenager, and I have a son in grade 10 right now. I have a son in grade 11, and it's such a challenging time because your whole world changes. But also at the same time, your body's changing, and you're never have more hormones in your life. I struggled. I definitely struggled when I was younger. That was part of me dropping out of school. But when I went back, I found my people. I found people who cared about me. And most of the doors that were opened for me were by allies. It was by non-Indigenous people who created space and place, and by Indigenous people who were in those first roles, who said, you know what, we need to do better, and opened a door for me. What would you tell yourself, Kayleen, your younger self?
Yeah, well, along the same lines, the hardest truth is everything is going to be all right, no matter what situation you're in, and you just got to keep putting one foot in front of the other, and have your goals and know what you want, and baby steps.
I love that, right? Baby steps. I was saying to my students today, I'm like, just keep swimming. As I storyline. It got me through my undergrad, my master's degree, even now, busy weeks. You keep that momentum, one step, it doesn't happen overnight. It's incremental changes, and eventually you get there. I do see that we have our last question before we finish, and it's, what can non-Indigenous people do in order to help encourage economic reconciliation? And did you want me to start, or do you want to start this one, Caitlin? Welcome back, Sandra. I'm so sorry for your technical issues. It's the reality of online.
I'm in a hotel that I will never stay in again in Toronto. I'm so sorry to have kept disappearing. I really want to hear your answer to this, though. This is one of the ones I wanted to pose to you myself.
All right. Okay, I can kick it off. What can non-Indigenous people do in order to encourage economic reconciliation? Indigenous rights are human rights. Indigenous rights are Canadian rights. And you are going to occupy spaces and places in all different types of jobs in your future. But the knowledge that you're gaining from this, you are unlearning, you are relearning, and when you know something isn't right, you can use that knowledge to influence the people around you, your sphere of influence. You can't change the world overnight necessarily. You're not going to do it all on your own, but we do it together. And I think about the hummingbird and this story that I was told when I was young of this hummingbird. The forest was on fire and all the animals are fleeing. And the hummingbird is flying towards the fire, and the animals stop and say, "Hummingbird, silly hummingbird, where are you going? There's a fire. You need to come to safety." And the hummingbird says, "Well, I'm bringing water to put out the fire." And the animals laugh at hummingbird. "Oh, silly hummingbird, what are you going to do with your tiny beak and a drop of water?" And the hummingbird looked back and said, "I might be small and it may only be a drop, but I'm doing what I can." So you find your gift, you know what you can do, and you do what you can. That's all each and every one of us can do, is you have that sphere of influence, you have your family, your friends, or wherever you're employed. You can decide that we're going to maybe purchase lunch from an Indigenous business. We're going to ensure we have representation. It's those incremental changes. You're not going to, reconciliation isn't a switch. It's small incremental changes. And that's what you can do.
That's a phenomenal answer. Yeah, taking one little step after another and building new ways of relationship, right? Within our colonial context, so that we can eventually, ideally, break it down and start doing things in a better way for all of us. Yeah, one piece at a time. So I believe we're at our time limit. So I just wanted to say a massive thank you to both you and Kaylin for sharing your wisdom, your knowledge. We know that information and knowledge are not the same things. We may get one from, say, university, but information is not knowledge, and knowledge is not wisdom. So thank you for the gifts that you have shared of your knowledge and wisdom with us today. Thanks for making that economic strategy understandable for us, Kaylin. I know I'm someone who feels very intimidated by the notion of economics. So thanks for that. Don't forget to come back tomorrow evening at the same time. So we're in 7 o'clock Eastern time. So in whatever time zone you're in, come back and we'll go on to our next piece, which will actually feature a couple of Indigenous entrepreneurs who own their own businesses, and they're going to talk about what their pathways have been, and that's going to be really exciting. So thank you so much, everyone, and hopefully we'll see you tomorrow.